Raiden Shogun was, believe it or not, considered a mid character upon release, and for a long time after, she was, and for some even still is, considered a mediocre or even poor DPS at Constellation 0. Well, I'm here to tell you that you need not use your Raiden as a skill bot for Hyper Bloom anymore, unless you want to, I guess, and that even at Constellation 0, she's my absolute favorite C0 DPS in the entire game. Welcome to Jello Impact, where we build and test every single character to help you decide who you want to wish for and build. Our Electro Archon, Her Excellency, the almighty Narukami Ogosho, God of Thunder, is a 5-star Electro Polearm character with 2 distinct roles. Firstly, she's a fantastic unit for Hyper Bloom, due to her skill proccing whenever the on-field unit does damage to an enemy and applying Electro frequently enough to max out Hyper Bloom damage. Her skill lasts an extremely long time, so it fits easily with virtually any possible team, and procs from a great distance away, so its range is never an issue. Her skill also buffs the damage of your entire teammate's burst, which is extremely useful since many characters do a huge percentage of their damage through their elemental burst. All this together makes her an ideal Hyper Bloom trigger, although Kuki is still often chosen anyways due to her healing role consolidation, as well as potentially wanting to use Raiden for her second and, in my opinion, much more satisfying playstyle. Raiden Shogun is also an on-field DPS whose elemental burst turns her into a sword-wielding lightning menace. She has massive AoE, bigger than most people even realize, a pretty large amount of front-loaded damage, both through her initial slash and her short but just long enough burst duration. This relatively short burst duration means she can take full advantage of the huge amount of buffs in the game, such as Bennett, Kazuha, any form of Viridescent Venerer, Yelan's buff, Kujo-Sara of course, and Furina as well. Not only this, she scales very well off of the energy recharge stat, allowing you to build a lot of ER without being punished heavily for it, or at all, depending on if you have her weapon. Her passive double dips, giving her additional energy restoration from her burst, as well as giving electro damage bonus through ER. Her best in slot artifact set is one of the most universal and powerful in the entire game, so the majority of people are going to be farming it anyways and getting great pieces for Raiden whether they mean to or not. She is a very stat hungry as a DPS, so it can be quite difficult for a new player to get a stat line that is properly balanced and high functioning. She by no means needs her weapon or her constellations to be an incredible DPS, but if you happen to have either or both, she gains a huge amount from both of them. Not as much as the best constellations in the game like Furina or Nahida for example, but Raiden enjoyers will never be disappointed by the early vertical investment value she can provide. Finally, Raiden has amazing free-to-play and 5-star weapon options, plus a ridiculous amount of great teams. With her very best carry team just coming out in Fontaine, and depending on your setup, she finally has a DPS option that gets close enough to Hyper Bloom teams that it doesn't feel like you're losing a ton from playing her as a carry at C0. Speaking of which, let's get into them. My current very favorite team in the game, and Raiden's new best team at all levels of play. Obviously this is a C0 guide, but even at C2, at R1, Raiden Furina Yelan Jean is her very best, again excluding the Hyper Bloom variations. This team makes me really excited because not only does it just shred through enemies, it's extremely comfy to play, it has amazing team-wide synergy, it uses a lot of really attractive characters, it's just the total package. Raiden obviously being your on-field DPS, benefits not only from Furina's buffs, but also Yelan's buffs. Obviously, Jean is here for Viridescent Venerer and healing to keep up with Furina. What makes this team really stand out above other double Hydro variations like Novelette Furina teams or something like that is, at least if you're comparing Constellation 0, having an on-fielder like Raiden with infinite interruption resistance just makes it so fun and satisfying to play, and standing in Jean's heals makes you nigh unkillable. It's also really nice not to have Bennett on this team for all of the enemies that use elemental attacks these days, because getting vaporized by Bennett can easily one-shot your on-fielder. So having Jean as your healer in this in this team is really, really awesome. If you're watching it in the future, who knows, we may have another healer Animo character as a limited 5-star. You never know, you didn't hear it from me. And, you know, if it's a limited 5-star, obviously it's probably going to be an upgrade for this team. Raiden also lowers the ER requirements across all the characters, meaning you can run a more damaging weapon on your Furina. You can still go with Festering Desire if you have it, but if you play your cards right, you can get a more damaging weapon on her. Same with Yelan. I highly recommend going with something that gives you more damage. If you happen to have Yelan's bow, the team gets a huge benefit from that. Same with Furina's signature. But even if you don't have their signature, just giving Yelan something like the Slingshot is a huge boost as opposed to the usual fav that you need to run on Yelan, because with Raiden you just don't need to run as much ER on Furina and Yelan, especially with the double hydro core, and if your gene is on Favonius, then that helps even more. Raiden herself really benefits from high base attack weapons on this team. Normally the catch is her best weapon, but for a team like this where you're not running Bennett, if you have another option other than the catch that has good synergy with her, you would prefer to go with that instead. Obviously, her signature is going to be the best, but even something like the Skyward Spine, if you have it, is a noticeable upgrade on this team because, again, the high base attack, using something like Homa, the Deathmatch, the Wavebreaker's Fin at high refines. I meant to say Primordial Jadewing Spear, but also the Deathmatch is an upgrade over the catch on this team, because the catch's biggest boon is that it provides elemental damage bonus and a lot of energy recharge and some crit rate. Well, the crit rate is good, the energy recharge is good, but the elemental damage bonus not super useful on this team because Furina provides so much and Yelan provides some as well. So you get much better returns running some sort of 5-star weapon. She gets a lot out of her signature, but like I said, if you have Homa, if you have Jadewing Spear, if there's a ton of early vertical investment potential, and although I don't have any of that except for I have Raiden's and Yelan's signature weapons, which I've tried out on this team, and of course it's awesome. But if you're more of a Dolphin player, man, there is tons of, or if you're just a hyper saver free to play and like to hyper invest, there is a ton of early vertical investment potential, and you will have like a C6 team with just having a few C2s. So really, really, really awesome. Another team I majorly played before this team came out. Now that this team's out, I don't play Raiden on basically anything else aside from, you know, switching Yelan with various other characters. Sometimes I'll put Yaimiko on this team with Furina. That works really well. If you don't have Yaimiko, you can use Fischl. You can use Sinkcho, especially against super aggressive enemies. The damage reduction works. You can use Kujo Sara in this slot. None of these options are as good as Yelan. I had all the math theory crafted for this video just so I could back up my claims. Yelan is the best option, but all of the other options are really good as well. You can use Lisa. The nice thing about using any DPS is Furina is just heavily buffing that other DPS as well. So as long as you're building the other off-field DPS well, you're gonna do great. I'm sure, I didn't try this, but you could use Xiangling. You'd need a lot of ER to make this work, but I actually think this would be a pretty good team if you wanted to try that. Moving on to the Hyper Raiden stuff. I say Hyper because traditionally, of course, it's gonna be C6 Kujo Sara on this team. You pretty much don't want to use Kujo Sara until she is C6. This team's biggest benefit is has a ton of front load. My Kujo Sara is not C6, so it definitely has not performed amazingly for me. I mostly use Raiden Yai, but I don't like this as much as Raiden Yai. Over here, this performs better, but this is still good. This is what I used for years. For the whole time I had Raiden, this was basically the only team I played her on. It's a very good AoE team. It's very good in multi-wave scenarios because often you can get Yaimiko to nuke down one wave of bosses and then quickly refresh your Kazuha before Raiden comes back on. Yaimiko does extend rotation slightly, which is really annoying, and as such, if your play is optimal, Fischl can be the higher damaging option in single target scenarios. Lisa's a decent option here. You can sort of do a mono pyro option with Xiangling if you're fighting bosses that require pyro to shield break, for example. It still feels really great, just not as great as this. This feels like cheating. This is what competes with the new wave of DPSs. It's not as strong as Neuvillette, but at least at C0, the comfort you get from Raiden's infinite interruption resistance makes me love it way more. Obviously, if you have C1 Neuvillette, then, then it's, We don't. Kind of sleeper pick team that I tried is basically using Raiden on Sino's team. So this is like a hybrid, like Raiden Quick Bloom, basically. It was really good. It slapped really hard. It's better than this team, for sure. So definitely an upgrade for Raiden overall. Furina buffing Raiden's and Nahida's damage. The nice thing that you can do is you can run Nahida on EM crit or EM, and her maxing out her passive is really important for buffing Raiden's EM because she'll be on field triggering hyper blooms as well as doing damage, and you want Baiju on instructors so that you can buff EM even more. If you happen to have Staff of the Scarlet Sands, that can be really nice for Raiden, or the Battle of the Fjords. Really good team. It's not like optimal, but if you have these units free, or if the elements check favorably against what you're fighting, then it's a really good choice. Raiden National is an old standby. For those not in the know, Yelan is actually the premier damage option for this spot, although slightly less comfy because Sinkcho provides that damage reduction. But overall, yeah, Yelan out DPSs. Raiden National, always great. I think one of the best parts of Raiden National is the multiple elemental type check coverage, the ease of play, all the same pros, right? Raiden's skill is buffing everyone's burst, Richa helping everyone with their energy recharge. Very good team. Raiden's also pretty darn good as an aggravate driver. Not as good as the likes of Yaimiko or Sino, but can be much more comfortable to play than either of them because of her interruption resistance. You can easily get away with Yao Yao and not need Baiju or Kirara as a comfort pick. She can also use the instructors and use the craftable Sumeru polearm to boost EM. Sucrose has nice EM sharing. Fischl, obviously with the golden troop set. This team is really great for free-to-plays who need an AoE team. And because Raiden, like, you can use her in Hyper Bloom, you can use her in other stuff. She's a great pull because this is a great free-to-play option. And then you don't need to build it. You don't need to build Kaching. You don't need to build Sino. You don't need to build Yaimiko. You can just build Raiden and have all these different team options. It's definitely not Raiden's best team, but it's one that easily clears any abyss. And then finally getting into the Hyper Bloom stuff, I tend to like this team a lot because you're really making the most of not needing of Raiden not being a healer because you can use Baiju as the driver. It only performs marginally worse than using Nahida as the driver. It is both more and less comfy because Baiju needs to be really in melee range to actually apply Dendro to the enemies, but still a really easy and great team to use. But you can also use the more traditional double hydro, technically has a higher DPS ceiling. Raiden's burst, Raiden's skill, boosting both Yelan and Sinkcho's bursts. This team you are running without a healer. The only defensive option you have is Sinkcho, so definitely be careful. You can replace Yelan with Fischl, but you can also replace Raiden with Kuki. I tend to more often use Kuki here, but Raiden technically is the more damaging and superior choice. Finally, she's really excellent on Novelette Hyper Blooms, which especially for C0, one of his best Hyper Bloom teams. Nahida and Raiden are essential, but the last slot is flexible. Obviously, I have Furina here because Furina is insane, does insane damage. You can also run Baiju in the Nahida slot, although Novelette, especially if you run Nahida on Prototype Amber, Novelette healing can easily max out Furina's stacks, but you can just flex anything for Furina. You can do Fischl, you can even put Kazuha on this team, although it's a little bit weird to get the swirls and everything like that. You can put Dea, you can put Zhongli. Novelette Hyper Bloom is awesome, and because Novelette has such big range, he really takes advantage of Raiden's big range because you can sit really far back and drive this team. So yeah, I mean I'm super biased, right? Raiden is my favorite character in the game. Is not even close. I've mained her ever since I got her a really long time ago, and it's great to see her just get better. And we'll put out one more shout out because Chevreuse is coming soon, and Raiden's going to be a character that works really well with Chevreuse. Raiden, Bennett, Xiangling, and Chevreuse in the last slot. This is going to be a really good team. A great option to free up your Sinkcho. Will it out damage the traditional Raiden National? I think it might, especially at C6, but it will definitely be very close. You can use Kujosara instead of Xiangling if Chevreuse is able to provide enough pyro. If you're watching this and Chevreuse is already out, then just go on and check out my Chevreuse guide because it's coming on day 1. I'll be testing Chevreuse with every single pyro and electro character, so I'll have an in-depth review of this team right over there. Not to be forgotten, her Sunfire team is really good as well. This is where Jean is going to be swirling off Bennett's pyro onto the enemy, which means you're going to be able to vaporize some of Yelan's damage, getting overloads, electro charges, etc. You can use Yelan or Sinkcho here both work really well. You want to start with Raiden's skill, Yelan's skill and burst, Jean's skill, Bennett's skill and burst, then Jean's burst to make sure you get all the elements applied properly. The team slaps. It's really, really good, especially for bossing where you don't need the grouping. Also, Raiden Eula is a thing that you can do. It's definitely a lot better for Eula than it is for Raiden. It's not one of Raiden's best teams, but I mean, Eula's super hot. This is a super great team, especially with Furina. It got a lot better, and it doesn't use a lot of the more contested units except for Furina, so it definitely has some positive. Pretty soon, I'm going to be doubling down and level 90ing my Eula, making sure my artifacts are up to snuff, which they're already pretty good, but I'm going to be giving this team another go pretty soon because I do love Eula's design and playstyle. It is Eula's best in slot support because she provides better AoE electro application than someone like Fischl, and the energy restoration is really nice for the entire team. You can go with Mika or Charlotte. You want to try and have Charlotte with Thrilling Tales if you can get, especially C4 Charlotte, lots of ER sub. Being able to pass Thrilling Tales to Eula definitely makes up for the lack of attack speed and crit damage, physical damage buff that doesn't all the way make up, but it is pretty good. Overall, I know I've been singing the praises of the Yelan Furina team a lot, and I mean the reason for that is because I think it's broken. It does so much damage that even in AoE you can easily brute force it even though there's no grouping, but it is much comfier to play a Raiden team that does have grouping when you're in AoE situation. So it's not like that the Yelan team is better in like every single scenario. That's one of the things about Genshin is matching up types, matching up your team building, matching up your rotation, matching up your builds, depending on the Abyss lineup you're facing, can make the difference between a really great clear and just kind of mediocre one or not a clear at all. And that's one of the best things about Raiden is that she has so many different options that no matter what the Abyss lineup calls for, no matter what elemental check, even if it's something like the Thundering Manifestation, you can still brute force your way through with a team like this, which I don't recommend. Or you can use a Hyper Bloom team, right? A team that actually does well into the Thundering Manifestation. So basically, no matter what the element is, there's something you can do with your Raiden to clear extremely efficiently. For her build guide, starting with level. If you're playing in Hyper Bloom, absolutely urgent to level 90 her. You need to do that right away. If you're not, it's definitely something you want to get to eventually. A DPS that does a very large portion of the team damage, especially if you're playing on our Hyper Carry team. Reminds me, I forgot to tell you my name for this team. This is Hyper Bloom because you're using it right on Hyper Bloom. It's Hyper Bloom. Comment down below whether you think that's good or cringe. And while you're down there, please subscribe. It actually really helps the channel. But yeah, as a hyper carry doing the majority of your team's damage on a lot of her teams, level 90ing her is a really, really good idea eventually, but not a priority like Animo units, like Hyper Bloom units, Hydra units, and Nilu teams. Not as high of a priority as them, and not as high a priority as something like Novelette or Furina, who scale off of HP, but definitely something you want to get around to. For talents, the main one is definitely her burst. Because you don't need to level up her normal attack at all, just double down and at least go level 9 on her burst if you're using her as a carry, of course, because it does a lot of damage and it has really good scaling. So one of the units that I personally think is worth it to crown, not like more worth it than, you know, Furina's skill or Yelan's burst or something like that, but especially if you're using her as a hyper carry and you don't crown her burst, it's like, what are you doing? Eventually, not right away, but you know, eventually. For her skill, it's very important. You do not need to crown her skill. The bonus damage she gives from her skill does not exceed level 9. So you only wanted to get it to level 9 max unless you're just simping. But until you crown your burst, I would even stick to level 8 and save the resources for her burst. Unless, of course, you're just Hyper Bloom triggering, in which case you only need to level up her skill. You should really never level up her normals. For her weapons, or Hyper Bloom first, you want to use an EM weapon. If you have High Refine, Battle of the Fjords, then this is her best Hyper Bloom weapon. Otherwise, it's Dragon's Bane, and you only need R1 because the passive does nothing. It's just for the Elemental Mastery. If you're using her as Hyper Carry, or just any sort of on-fielder, Engulfing Lightning is her best. Not only is it the highest damage, but it also increases the energy recharge scaling that she has, meaning that you can build even more heavily into ER instead of attack without being punished. You can just max her ER, which is really comfy because if you miss slashes, if you get bad RNG, because her burst regeneration has a bit of RNG, Engulfing Lightning just is like a comfy safety blanket that not only does it give you a ton of ER, but it gives you scaling based on the ER that you build. Now, because the scaling is in the form of attack percent, that means it has pretty middling returns on Bennett teams. So historically, people have gone all the way to Constellation 3 Raiden before even considering her weapon. However, on her new best teams, Furina teams, the attack percent is much more valuable because Furina gives a ton of damage percent. Yelan gives damage percent. You get no attack percent. If you're using something like the catch, getting the damage percent 32, which is very valuable on Bennett teams, is all of a sudden very bad or very diminishing returns on Furina teams. So you really want to instead go for something like the Engulfing Lightning. If you don't have the Engulfing Lightning and you're using on Furina teams, then going for the Staff of Homa is really good. That's her second best option generally. The catch is really good. Calamity Queller is really good. Basically any 5-star weapon is really good. If you want a detailed ranking, you can check out the Kaching Man's website, but just be careful because it hasn't been updated for Furina yet. So even though they list the catch as like the second best option, it does fall behind basically all of the 5-star options when you're using outside of Bennett. As you can see, actually, it doesn't calc above basically any of the 5-star weapons officially, and this will be even more of a disparity when you're using Furina-based teams. But still, it's an incredible weapon, especially if you are using Bennett, and it helps with crit rate, which is really nice. But yeah, I basically mentioned all of these. So also the Deathmatch is a surprising alternative, especially if you do have Hierophines on Furina teams, because of that attack percent it gives is really nice. Definitely better than the catch with Furina. Basically, high base attack and damage and other stats good with Furina. Energy recharge, the catch is good with Bennett. And I know this is going to sound crazy, but especially if you're using her on a national team, you can strongly consider Favonius Lance. This allows you to reduce the energy recharge on your Shangling and Sinkcho even further because she's going to get a lot of procs from the Favonius Lance. If you're a real Raiden main and enjoyer, you probably, well, and the other thing is it lets your Shangling use the catch, and this is technically better than letting Shangling hold the Favonius Lance and letting Raiden use the catch, because Shangling does a lot of damage and Raiden will get a lot more procs than Shangling will with the Lance. But true Raiden enjoyers will not be able to look at their Raiden with Favonius Lance, at least in my opinion, but it's definitely a great option if you want to go for it. Also, Prospector's Drill. You know, I bet this is really good if you have a high refined Prospector's Drill for some reason. I bet this is really good on the Furina Jean team since it's an attack percent weapon that gives damage bonus and attack. I bet you this is really good on the Furina Jean team. For artifacts, if you're using Hyper Bloom, obviously full EM, with Flowers of Paradise Lost being the very tippy top, Gilded Dreams being second best, but only just barely, pretty much just as good, and then 2-piece EM if you don't have one of the 4-piece options. If you're using her normally, Emblem of Severed Fates is your best option. You're going to be going Energy Recharge or Attack Percent Sands, Attack Percent or Electro Damage Bonus Goblet, and Crit Rate or Crit Damage Mask. Whether you go for an ER or Attack Percent weapon depends on two things. It's like a flowchart. One, do you have Engulfing Lightning? If yes, always go for ER because then you get attack for your ER, so that's just the best option. And then the next question is, if you don't have Engulfing Lightning, do you have enough energy recharge from your substats, etc. to burst off cooldown? If you don't, energy recharge Sands. If you do, attack Sand. For your Goblet, it's actually kind of similar. You generally want electro damage bonus Goblet. If you are using Furina, you generally want to go with attack percent, especially if you're using the catch, you want to use attack percent. But I am well aware of how cursed this domain can be. I've never gotten a good electro damage bonus or energy recharge piece to drop in this domain at all. So I've always used attack percent, regardless of whether I was using Bennett or Furina or the catch or whatever. I was always using attack percent, and it's been fine. So you can use attack percent. If you're going to use attack percent on a Bennett team, then the catch really is quite important for having that elemental burst damage. And that is a nice bonus that you at least get some electro damage bonus from your passive. That's what really makes this viable at all. Also, if you're using Furina, you can use Maria Shisei Hunter. I think it comes out to right around the same damage with Furina, very close to Emblem of Severed Fates. Of course, this will restrict you to using her only with Furina, but you know, first, if for some reason you don't have any emblem pieces or you're using them all in Yelan, or I don't know, you just can't get lucky, but you have great Maria Shisei pieces, then by all means, you know, Maria Shisei it up for your Raiden. For substats, of course, crit rate, crit damage, but don't undervalue attack percent and energy recharge. Both of them are very valuable if you're using her on Aggravator, Quick Bloom. Elemental Mastery is a good substat too. This is what a a really invested Raiden can look like. You don't need to have this ratio for her to perform well. This is like insane levels of Raiden. Because she doesn't scale with crit rate or because she doesn't ascend with crit rate or crit damage, and because her weapon doesn't give her crit rate or crit damage, it can be very hard to get a good balance of crit rate and crit damage and get enough ER and get some attack as well. So like, do your best. If you have 60, 120, it is what it is. If you have 65, 130, or 60, 140, or 70, 130, you know, it is what it is. You gotta use what you can get. I started to feel like she did a lot better once I had the catch and I was 60, 140. So it ended up being 72, 140 after the catch. She felt a lot better once I kind of hit that around that level. For energy recharge, she needs anywhere between 210 to 250, I would say. If you have engulfing lightning, then going over that is totally fine. I've never really felt the need to go over 240 for her to get her burst back, but I found anything less than 215, at least to me, feels very scuffed. Even 215, I don't enjoy it. I like the comfort of having at least 230. I played around with it a ton back when I didn't have her weapon, so you have to play around with it too, depending on the team you're using. You know, if you're using Fav on Jean or other characters that have Fav, probably they're not using Fav because they're going to be relying on some energy recharge for Raiden, but I've usually run Jean on Fav or Kazuo on Fav, so you need even less on Raiden. But as usual with ER, you have to use what you have and how you play and how you like to run with your ER, because again, her burst ER regeneration is RNG, so I prefer to be on the higher side than the lower side, just so I don't have to reset if I get bad luck RNG. You have lots of chances to proc. I think it's like a 50% chance to proc her ER passive every time you slash, so it's not like the worst RNG in the world, but still. For gameplay tips, rotations, etc. For combos, I think her best combo is generally N3C, 3 normal attacks into a charge attack. If you're using Yelan or Sinkcho, generally it's going to be N3 dash, so that's 3 normal attacks into a dash, and that cancels that animation. You can just kind of repeat that. For rotations, you'll almost always want to start with your skill, and then you generally want to go in descending order of cooldown, so longest cooldown first, then shorter, and ideally whatever you want to reverse that with buff uptime. So Kazuo's buff, Viridescent Venom buff is generally pretty short. Bennett buff generally pretty short, so you want to use those towards the end of the rotation. On this team, I'm pretty sure the best rotation, I made this myself, so I don't know if there's a better one up there. You want to skill with Raiden, then skill and burst with Farina, then skill with Jean, burst, then skill with Yelan, then burst with Jean, then burst with Raiden, and then skill with Raiden, repeat. That way, you get a little cheeky swirl in for you use Yelan, and that way you can also normal attack with Yelan as well. I forgot to mention that, because that way that swirl, you get the Viridescent Venom resistance shred for when you use Yelan's burst and skill and her normal attack, which gives her a pretty nice little damage boost on that team. And you have the rotation time to do it because all these characters cycle through pretty fast. You can have very tight rotations on this team, and so you have plenty of time to swap to Jean twice. There might be a better rotation that allows you to get 2 skills per rotation for Jean. Maybe use burst and then skill with Jean. I'm not sure. Comment down below if you have a better rotation for this team. This one's been working extremely well for me, but let me know if there's something better out there. I'll add it to the pinned comment. For rotations with Kazuo, again, the main thing you want to use Raiden's skill first. If you're using Bennett on the team, and you're going to be using Bennett's burst first in the rotation, so you might want to do this on official team or on a Kujisara team, then you want to make sure you don't use Bennett's skill so that it doesn't override the aura with pyro, and you can still, and when you use Kazuo's burst and skill, you can both infuse his burst with pyro while also swirling electro. You want to infuse his burst with pyro on Bennett teams because the overloadeds that happen with Raiden providing electro and Kazuo providing pyro, Kazuo would be overloading and it will be doing a lot of damage. You definitely don't want to miss that damage by infusing with electro. If you're playing this team in AoE and the enemies are very staggerable and vulnerable to overload, you may choose to use Kazuo's skill and burst before using Bennett's burst to infuse it with electro so that you don't knock back enemies too much. And because of Raiden's AoE, that will be, she'll do a lot of AoE damage. You don't need that overloaded damage. If you're using the national team, whether it's Sinkcho or Yelan, you'll want to use their skill and burst or burst and skill, then Bennett burst, then skill funnel into Shangling burst, etc. And of course, using Raiden's skill first. Hopefully you're starting to get the idea of constructing rotations. for account value and for my power rank. If you want to know our power ranking, check out my tier list video. I'll put it in the pinned comment. I think she's definitely one of the better DPSs in the game if you include the fact that she has infinite interruption resistance, which if you run a healer, it's basically like you just have Zhongli's shield. Like, think about how nice it is to have a DPS using Zhongli's shield, and think about if that was just built into someone's kit. Like, that's kind of ridiculous. Very few on-field DPSs have infinite interruption resistance. Like, who does? No, 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 no. Only with his C1. No, 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 no. Like, basically nobody. Eula kind of does. Dea does, if she has her skill up. No, 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 no. Yes. So, like, that's pretty insane. And I think people overlook that quite a bit. So her comfort as a DPS is basically unparalleled. Couple that with the energy regeneration, allowing you to build more damage in your other teams. I don't think she's as good of a DPS. Like, I know I said best DPS in the title, of course, with the asterisks, and that's because, yeah, at C0, if you value the flexibility that she brings, like, think about all the teams that she has. The double Hydro with Farina and Jean, Hyper, Aggravate, Hyper Bloom, or the Quick Bloom, just Hyper Bloom in general. Like, these are a ton of meta teams, like really, really strong teams. I think that Alhaitham, in terms of pure power, is higher. And Novelette in terms of pure power is higher. Even Hu Tao in terms of pure power is higher, although more single target restricted than Raiden. And Novelette, if you have his C1, he also gets that infinite interruption resistance. And so if you have his C1, you know, if you have his weapon, or even just with his C1, or even just with his weapon, Novelette definitely clears by a lot, by pretty much every metric. And I don't think it's very close, but Novelette still clears, obviously. He can still solo abysses. But you don't need crazy the best levels of damage to beat the abyss. And with just a C0 Raiden, you get your Hyper Bloom team, you get an Aggravate team, you get a National team, you get the double Hydra Farina team, and you get a DPS with infinite interruption resistance. Makes it easier to build your other characters with ER stuff. But I don't want you to get the wrong idea. I don't think that you should pull Raiden for power. I think she hits pretty high levels, but Navia also hits those levels. Wanderer also hits those levels. Ayaka hits those levels. Ganyu comes close. Cyno comes close. Yamiko can hit those levels. Alhaitham has higher levels, right? Lots of DPSs hit those levels, and then there's more that I didn't mention, but I think it's the comfort that also adds to it. But a DPS is a DPS is a DPS. I think she's a more valuable than average pull for a DPS. I think the valuable DPSs, I think Novelette's probably the most valuable, then probably Raiden. I think she has the most flexibility and the most new player friendliness for pretty much any DPS. And I really am considering ease of play, because I know a lot of people in the comments will come up to me and will say, hey, you know, Tainari does so much more damage, or Hu Tao is actually so good, or Ganyu is actually amazing, you're underrating Wanderer. The reality is that some of us like to mash. And if you like to mash, then Raiden's your gal, plain and simple. For future prospects, we basically know that Cloud Retainer is going to increase her best team to even greater levels by replacing Jean, which is awesome. Is that going to be better? Because if you're going to just get her just to replace Jean, is that going to be better than putting those wishes towards a Raiden constellation, or a Yelan or Farina constellation, or a signature weapon? That remains to be seen. But if you don't have a Jean and you still want to build this team, then that's really cool that option is going to be available to you. Chevreuse is, I don't think it's going to be any sort of ceiling team, but I do think that it will be another fun option that will add another option on top of all those teams you talked about. You'll have overloaded teams as an option, so that's really, really cool. Basically, anytime an off-field DPS comes to the fray, Raiden has a chance to shine again. Like Yelan, I didn't talk about it too much, and I probably should have more, but Yelan has sneakily become the best single target option for this team, for her hyper team. And you can use Farina here too. And that's just the thing about Raiden, is that you can just, especially with Farina, but even before that, no matter what, you can just slot in off-field DPSs with Raiden, and she makes them work better than average, because it's not only them supporting her, she also gives something back with the elemental burst damage bonus, and with the energy recharge. Basically anything but cryo characters, a new DPS, a new off-field DPS is more potential for Raiden to do well. I'd be surprised if any character came out that power crept her in what I would consider the best Electro DPS at this point. But I mean, it's possible that Clorand is coming. I don't think I would skip Raiden anticipating Clorand to power creep Raiden. I don't think you get Raiden for her power anyways. I think you get her because you like her playstyle. You find it satisfying, you find it fun, or you like the versatility, but even an on-field character is never going to be as versatile as an off-field character. But I think if you're a Raiden lover, you can get Raiden and rest assured that your Raiden is going to be really good for a long time. And heck, if they don't release any new supports for her, you can just save up for constellations. Speaking of constellations, for vertical investment, what is best? Well, we all know that C2 is insane. Raiden ignores 60% of opponents' defense, which is a separate multiplier than basically anything we have in the game. Basically, no characters give defense ignore at all. So this 60% comes out to be a 40% damage increase for Raiden, which is huge. She does a pretty high percentage of team damage in the Farina Jean team, for example, and even more in her hyper carry team. So her Constellation 2 is the #1 priority, especially if you are using that Farina Jean team, especially if you have a different 5-star weapon like Homa or Jadewing Spear, Calamity Queller, Skyward Spine, then definitely her C2 is #1. But nowadays, it used to be that C3 would be the next best, but if you have, and it might be different if you do have Homa or something, C3 might still be better. But if you're using this team, then it is better to go for her weapon than to go for her C3. So priority #1, go for her C2, then her weapon, then you can consider her C3. But I would also strongly recommend that after you get her C2, or even before, even you get her weapon. It depends on what you like. If you love Raiden, then you can go for her C2 first, then her weapon, then look at constellations for Farina and Yelan. But you probably want to go for Farina's C2 first if you're just considered with optimizing your teams. Then you can look at Raiden's C2, then you can look at Raiden's weapon, you can look at Yelan's C2. This team has a lot of potential to dolphin out and create just a crazy strong dolphin team. I won't be doing anything like that. It's possible that I go for her C2 one day, but I'm not sure. Jean also benefits them. I activated her C2 before I became a content creator, so I have had advantage from the attack speed, which is really nice. So if you get lots of Jean, then that's another way that it'll improve. I personally love going for Engulfing Lightning as a priority just because of the drip. It has new life on this team. It's especially good on this team, and the drip just looks so insane. So if you're more in favor, if you're a drip enjoyer, I actually think Skyward Spine looks pretty good too, but I don't have it. But if you're a drip enjoyer, then going for Engulfing Lightning is a really, really good call. Finally, for Overworld, I think Raiden is solid for Overworld. I think if you are going to use her for Overworld, you definitely want both an ER weapon and an ER Sands, because sometimes your Constellation 2 will just overkill enemies. And that's another reason to just go for extra ER in general, is because if you overkill enemies, whether you have Constellation 2 or C0, if you overkill enemies, it can be annoying to not have enough ER. Once you play with her a lot, you get used to knowing how much ER you need, and so sometimes when you're playing, I should have included this in the gameplay tips, but here's a reward for those of you who stuck around to the end. Sometimes you don't want to use everyone's burst on the team. If you can kind of gauge how much damage you're going to do and how much you need to kill the enemy, because you want to end at the end of Raiden's burst. So maybe you don't use Yelan's burst if the enemy is almost dead. You just use Jean's, and so then you just kill the boss enough to recharge Jean's burst. Or maybe you don't use Raiden's burst and you save it for the next wave. And in the overworld, this is especially true. Maybe you're basically clearing most waves or most overworld stuff with just Kazuha and Raiden. But for overworld, she's solid, but not insane, because her damage is tied to her burst. Let me know if you're getting Raiden. Let me know if I missed anything, and I'll add it to the pinned comment. Thanks so much. Bye for now.